What if I told you that the US Army genuinely tried to deploy exploding bats as weapons during World War II? American history is filled with moments so absurd, so strange, so completely ridiculous that they sound like they were made up by someone who'd had too much coffee and not enough sleep. But here's the beautiful thing: every single one of them is true, documented, verified, sitting in archives waiting for someone to find them and wonder what on earth our ancestors were thinking. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to explore 101 facts about US history that sound absolutely fake but are totally, undeniably real. Before we dive in, if you enjoy falling asleep to bizarre historical truths, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next strange journey through America's past. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's start with something that technically made every founding father a criminal. The Declaration of Independence was technically illegal treason when it was signed. So here's the thing about July 4th, 1776. When those 56 men gathered in Philadelphia to sign the Declaration of Independence, they weren't just making history. They were committing what the British Empire considered high treason, punishable by death. Specifically, they'd be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is exactly as medieval and unpleasant as it sounds. Benjamin Franklin apparently joked they must all hang together, or they'd surely hang separately, which is darkly hilarious when you remember he wasn't kidding. The document they signed literally declared war on the most powerful military force on Earth. No permission slip, no legal loophole, just pure documented rebellion written in elegant script on parchment. King George III would have happily executed every single one of them, and they knew it. They signed anyway, some with flourishes, some hesitantly. John Hancock's signature is famously large, possibly so King George could read it without his spectacles, which is either brave or suicidal depending on your perspective. But every name on that page was technically a confession, a signed, dated, witnessed confession to treason. And yet they did it. Which brings us to something equally symbolic that also didn't quite work as planned. The Liberty Bell cracked almost immediately and was rung anyway for decades. The Liberty Bell is basically America's most famous broken thing. It cracked the very first time it was tested in 1753, fresh off the boat from London. The foundry workers must have felt fantastic about that. So they melted it down and recast it, because apparently colonial Philadelphia believed in second chances. Then it cracked again. They fixed it again. And then, because Americans are nothing if not stubborn, they kept ringing this increasingly damaged bell for major occasions throughout the late 1700s. It rang for important announcements, celebrations, funerals, just this progressively more cracked bell gonging away in Philadelphia like everything was fine. The final irreparable crack likely happened sometime in the 1800s, possibly for George Washington's birthday, which seems fitting in a tragic way. Now it sits in Philadelphia, silent and broken, behind climate-controlled glass, while millions of tourists photograph what is essentially a very famous failure. It's inspiring, really, that America's symbol of liberty is something that broke almost immediately but kept going anyway, which is oddly perfect. But speaking of things early Americans got wrong from the start, let's talk about produce. Early Americans genuinely believed tomatoes were poisonous. For most of early American history, people looked at tomatoes the way you might look at a decorative but suspicious mushroom. They grew them as ornamental plants, pretty and red, and absolutely not for eating. The reasoning was almost sound. Tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, which does include some genuinely poisonous plants. Also, wealthy colonists often ate off pewter plates, and tomato acid would leach lead from the pewter, which actually did poison people. So they blamed the tomatoes instead of their fancy dishware, which tracks. This belief persisted well into the 1800s. There's a famous story about Robert Gibbon Johnson eating a tomato publicly in 1820 in New Jersey to prove they weren't deadly, though historians debate whether that actually happened or if it's folklore. Either way, tomatoes were viewed with deep suspicion for decades. Imagine living in a world where salsa doesn't exist because everyone thinks the main ingredient will kill you. No marinara sauce, no ketchup, just Americans growing beautiful red fruit and refusing to taste it, convinced it was toxic. Eventually, of course, someone braved it and survived, and American cuisine was never the same. But long before we figured out tomatoes, we were already arguing about measurements. Congress once debated whether the U.S. should use the metric system in the 1790s. Yes, the metric system debate is not new. In 1790, Thomas Jefferson actually proposed that the United States adopt a decimal-based measurement system. He was Secretary of State at the time and genuinely enthusiastic about standardizing weights and measures using base 10 logic, which makes sense if you've ever tried to explain to a child why there are 12 inches in a foot. France was developing the metric system around the same time, and Jefferson was paying attention. Congress debated it. They considered it seriously, and then they just didn't do it. America stuck with inherited British imperial measurements, apparently out of sheer inertia and possibly spite, given we'd just fought a war against Britain. So now we're the only major country still clinging to feet, pounds, and Fahrenheit, measuring things in ways that make no mathematical sense. You'd think the founding fathers would have had the foresight to avoid this mess, but no. We could have been metric from day one. We almost were. But instead, we're still converting recipes and confusing the rest of the world. At least we gave the president's residence a dignified name. Or did we? The White House was originally called the President's Palace. Before it was the White House, America's executive mansion had a much fancier, somewhat awkward name: the President's Palace, or the President's House, or the Executive Mansion. Nobody could quite settle on it. Palace was briefly popular, which is ironic considering Americans had just overthrown a monarchy, specifically to avoid palaces and kings. Calling it a palace felt a bit too royal, a bit too European, a bit too much like the thing they'd just spent years fighting against. So the names kept shifting. Officially, it was the Executive Mansion for over a century. White House was informal slang because, well, it was a large White House, but it wasn't officially called the White House until Theodore Roosevelt put it on his stationery in 1901, over 100 years after it was built. Before that, it was just that big white building where the president lived, whatever you wanted to call it. The name confusion feels very on brand for early America, very passionate about rejecting monarchy, less clear on what to call things instead. Still, at least the building existed, which is more than the first president could say. George Washington never lived in the White House. It wasn't finished yet. George Washington is literally the reason the White House exists. He approved the design, he picked the location, he oversaw the planning, and then he never actually lived there. Construction started in 1792, but it wasn't finished until 1800, 3 years after Washington left office and 1 year after he died. John Adams was the first president to actually move in, arriving in November 1800 to a house that was still under construction, with wet plaster and unfinished rooms. Abigail Adams famously hung laundry in the unfinished East Room because it was the only space large enough, which is not exactly the majestic image you'd expect. So, Washington spent his entire presidency living in temporary housing in New York and Philadelphia, moving with the capital, never sleeping in the house built for him. It's weirdly sad, like planning a dream home and dying before the foundation dries. He'd be pleased to know it eventually got finished, and became iconic, but he never saw it completed, which makes you wonder what else early America was winging. Like, say, counting people. The first US Census missed millions of people. In 1790, the United States attempted its first official census, as required by the brand new Constitution. The goal was simple: count everyone. The result was less simple. The final count came in at roughly 3.9 million people, which sounds official until you realize they missed vast numbers of enslaved people, didn't count Native Americans at all unless they paid taxes, and had no way to accurately track people in remote areas. Census takers traveled on foot or horseback, knocking on doors in a country with almost no roads and plenty of people who didn't trust the government enough to answer questions. Some people hid, some were never reached, some were deliberately excluded. The whole thing was a well meaning mess, and everyone knew it. The census has gotten more accurate over the centuries, obviously, but that first attempt was essentially an educated guess with paperwork. They tried their best, and their best missed millions. At least they picked a practical location for the capital. Oh, wait, they didn't. The national capital was built on a literal swamp. Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp. Not metaphorically, literally. The land chosen for the nation's capital was marshy, humid, mosquito infested, and prone to flooding. In summer, it was unbearably hot and damp. In winter, it was cold and muddy. Politicians hated it. Foreign diplomats hated it. Basically, everyone except the mosquitoes hated it. But the location was a compromise between northern and southern states, chosen because it was geographically central and politically neutral, sitting between Maryland and Virginia. So they drained some swamps, filled in some wetlands, and built a capital city anyway because apparently spite is a powerful motivator. To this day, Washington, D.C. is humid and swampy in summer. A reminder that the founders prioritized geography over comfort. It's hot, it's sticky, and it was built on land that didn't really want a city. But they put the government there anyway. Carved streets into the mud and called it good. Which is very American, picking a terrible location and making it work through sheer stubbornness. At least the flag turned out nice. Or did it? America's first flag likely didn't look like the famous Betsy Ross version. The Betsy Ross story is charming. A Philadelphia seamstress approached by George Washington himself to sew the first American flag with 13 stars in a circle. It's patriotic, it's iconic, and it's probably not true. The story didn't appear until 1870, nearly a century after the fact, when Betsy Ross's grandson told it publicly. There's no contemporary evidence Washington met with Ross, no documentation, no receipts. The first official flag had 13 stripes and 13 stars, yes, but the star arrangement wasn't standardized. Different flags had different patterns: rows, circles, random scatters. It was chaotic. Betsy Ross may have sewn flags. She likely did. But the specific story of her meeting Washington and designing the circular star pattern appears to be family legend, repeated until it became history. Americans love a good origin story, even if it's not entirely factual. The truth is messier. Early American flags were inconsistent, handmade, and varied widely. But the Betsy Ross narrative is neater, so that's what we remember. At least we didn't put Washington's face on money while he was alive, except we almost did. The US once considered putting George Washington's face on coins while he was alive. In the 1790s, Congress seriously debated putting George Washington's face on US coins. It made sense. He was universally respected. Everyone knew his face, and it would have been a strong symbol of the new nation. But Washington himself shut it down. He thought it was too monarchical, too much like putting a king's face on currency, which was exactly what America had just fought against. He preferred coins to feature abstract symbols of liberty instead, which is why early American coins show Lady Liberty rather than presidents. It was a rare moment of humility in politics. The man literally said no to being immortalized on money. Eventually, of course, his face ended up on currency anyway, the dollar bill and the quarter, but only after he was safely dead and couldn't object. If he'd agreed in the 1790s, we'd have been putting living presidents on coins from day one, which would have gotten weird fast. Instead, Washington set a precedent of restraint. But speaking of national symbols that didn't start out very American, let's talk about the anthem. The Star Spangled Banner is based on a British drinking song. The melody of the U.S. national anthem comes from a British drinking song called To Anacreon in Heaven, written in the 1770s for a London gentleman's club. It was a popular tune for toasts, celebrations, and getting cheerfully drunk while singing about Greek poets. Then, in 1814, Francis Scott Key wrote new lyrics after watching the British bombard Fort McHenry and set them to this conveniently familiar melody. So, the Star Spangled Banner is technically a patriotic American poem sung to a British bar song, which is either ironic or perfect depending on your sense of humor. The tune is notoriously difficult to sing, with a range that makes professional singers nervous, and that's because it was written for drunk amateur singers who didn't care about hitting the high notes. It didn't become the official national anthem until 1931, over a century after it was written, because apparently America took a while to commit. But every time you hear it before a baseball game, you're listening to a recycled British drinking song, which honestly feels very resourceful. And speaking of early American traditions that were less than transparent, let's discuss the Senate. The original U.S. Senate met behind closed doors in secret. For the first 5 years of its existence, the U.S. Senate conducted all its business in secret. Closed doors, no press, no public galleries, just senators debating and voting in private, which seems slightly counterintuitive for a democracy. The House of Representatives was public from the start, but the Senate insisted on privacy, arguing they needed space to debate freely without public pressure, which sounds noble until you realize it also means nobody knew what their senators were actually doing. Citizens had no idea how their representatives voted or what arguments were made. The Senate didn't open its doors to the public until 1794, and even then, they were reluctant. The reasoning was that the Senate was supposed to be the more deliberative, less reactive chamber, insulated from mob mentality. But it also meant early American democracy had a significant chunk of government operating in total secrecy. Eventually, transparency won, but it took years. At least they were consistent about time, right? Oh, wait. The country didn't have a standardized time system until railroads demanded one before railroads. American towns set their clocks based on the sun. Noon was whenever the sun was highest in the sky, which meant every town had a slightly different time. It was chaos, but slow-moving chaos, so nobody cared. Then trains arrived. Suddenly you needed to coordinate schedules across hundreds of miles, and noonish didn't cut it anymore. Trains were crashing, connections were missed, and the railroad companies were losing money. So in 1883, the railroads just decided to create time zones themselves. They divided the country into 4 zones, declared it standard, and told everyone to adjust their clocks. The federal government didn't officially adopt this system until 1918, 35 years later. So for decades, American time zones were a private railroad initiative that the government eventually shrugged and accepted. It worked, so why argue? Now we have standardized time, all because trains needed schedules. Before that, America just vibed with approximate noon. And speaking of things that took forever, let's talk about early elections. Early American elections sometimes lasted weeks. Modern elections feel long, but early American elections were genuinely endless. Voting happened over days or even weeks, depending on the state. There was no single election day. Polling places were sparse, often requiring voters to travel long distances on foot or horseback. Some states held elections over multiple days, so people had time to arrive, cast their vote, and leave. This meant results trickled in slowly, vote counts were inconsistent, and nobody knew who won until weeks after voting started. It was logistically messy and ripe for confusion, but it was the best system they had given the technology and infrastructure of the time. Imagine refreshing election results for 3 weeks straight. The stress alone would be unbearable. Eventually, Congress standardized Election Day in 1845, setting it as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which is why we vote when we do. But for decades before that, elections were drawn out, chaotic affairs. At least the national symbols were straightforward, except they almost weren't. One of the founding fathers proposed a seal featuring Moses parting the Red Sea. When designing the Great Seal of the United States, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson both proposed designs featuring biblical imagery. Franklin wanted Moses parting the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army drowning in the background, and the motto, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." Jefferson preferred the Israelites being led through the wilderness by pillars of cloud and fire. Both designs were meant to symbolize America escaping tyranny, drawing parallels between the American Revolution and the Exodus story. Congress politely declined both proposals and eventually settled on the eagle design we know today, which is less dramatic but also less likely to offend anyone. It's fascinating that two of the most prominent founders wanted explicitly religious imagery on the national seal, given how much modern debate centers on the separation of church and state. The designs were rejected, but the fact they were seriously considered tells you something about the era. And speaking of things that weren't immediately popular, the Bill of Rights had a rough start. The Bill of Rights was not popular when first proposed. When James Madison proposed the Bill of Rights in 1789, a lot of people hated the idea. Some thought it was unnecessary because the Constitution already limited government power. Others worried that listing specific rights would imply those were the only rights people had. Alexander Hamilton argued against it, saying it was redundant and potentially dangerous. Anti-Federalists wanted stronger protections. Federalists thought it was pointless. It was a hard sell from every direction. Eventually, Madison managed to push through 12 amendments, 10 of which were ratified and became the Bill of Rights. But it took years of debate and compromise, and even then, several states dragged their feet ratifying it. Massachusetts didn't ratify the Bill of Rights until 1939, 150 years late, apparently just to make a point. So, the document Americans now revere as fundamental was controversial, contested, and nearly didn't happen. Democracy is messy. It always has been. And speaking of mess, the Capitol couldn't stay in one place. The U.S. Capitol moved several times before settling on Washington, D.C. Before Washington, D.C. became the permanent capital, the U.S. government bounced around like it couldn't commit to a lease. The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, then fled to Lancaster, then York, Pennsylvania, during the Revolutionary War because the British kept invading. After independence, the capital moved to Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, and New York City at various points. Congress met in 8 different cities in less than 15 years. It was embarrassing. Foreign diplomats didn't know where to send mail. The government was essentially nomadic. Finally, in 1790, a compromise was reached. Build a new capital from scratch on the Potomac River. Neutral territory that wouldn't favor any existing state. Construction started, and by 1800, the government officially moved to Washington, D.C., which was still a construction site, but at least a permanent one. The capital has stayed there ever since, mostly because nobody wants to move again. And speaking of national symbols Americans argue about, let's discuss the eagle. Some early Americans believed bald eagles were lazy thieves. Benjamin Franklin allegedly hated the bald eagle as a national symbol, calling it a bird of bad moral character. He wasn't entirely wrong. Bald eagles are opportunistic scavengers that often steal food from other birds rather than hunting themselves. They'll harass ospreys until they drop their fish, then swoop in and grab it. It's efficient, but not exactly noble. Franklin supposedly preferred the turkey, which he described as a more respectable bird, though historians debate whether he was serious or just being sarcastic in a private letter. Either way, the eagle won. It became the national symbol, appearing on the Great Seal, currency, and government buildings. Americans decided the eagle looked majestic and powerful, even if its actual behavior was less impressive. The turkey, meanwhile, became Thanksgiving dinner, which seems like the ultimate loss. But Franklin's complaint stuck in history, a reminder that even national symbols are subjective. And speaking of July 4th, it wasn't quite the celebration we imagine. The Declaration of Independence wasn't widely read aloud on July 4th, 1776. July 4th, 1776 is celebrated as Independence Day, but the Declaration wasn't dramatically read aloud to cheering crowds that day. Congress approved the final text on July 4th, yes, but it wasn't publicly proclaimed until July 8th, when it was read aloud in Philadelphia's Independence Square. Even then, most colonists didn't hear about it for days or weeks. News traveled slowly. Some people found out through newspapers, others heard secondhand. The famous public reading in Philadelphia happened 4 days late, and even that was just one city. The rest of the country caught up gradually. So the image of the Declaration being read to jubilant crowds on July 4th is a bit of a myth. It happened, just not when we think. The 4th became the symbolic date because it was on the document, but the actual celebration was delayed and scattered. Still, Americans eventually embraced fireworks for the occasion. Not everyone was thrilled. Fireworks were controversial in early Independence Day celebrations. Fireworks became associated with Independence Day almost immediately, but not everyone loved the tradition. By the 1800s, cities were banning fireworks due to injuries, fires, and general chaos. People were losing fingers. Buildings were burning down. Every 4th of July turned into a public safety nightmare. Doctors called it the most dangerous holiday. Newspapers published annual lists of casualties, burns, amputations, accidental deaths. It was grim. Reformers pushed for safe and sane 4th of July celebrations, advocating for public fireworks displays instead of individuals setting off explosives in the streets. Some cities banned personal fireworks entirely. The debate continued for decades. Americans loved fireworks, but also loved not dying. So it was a tough call. Eventually, regulations improved and professional displays became the norm, but for a long time, Independence Day was genuinely hazardous. Still, at least fireworks were just dangerous. Some presidential moments were downright absurd, which brings us to the White House itself. A sitting president was once arrested for speeding. On a horse, Ulysses S. Grant holds the distinction of being arrested while serving as President of the United States. In 1872, Grant was driving his horse and buggy through the streets of Washington, D.C., reportedly enjoying the speed a bit too much. A police officer named William West spotted the president racing along M Street and pulled him over for exceeding the speed limit. Grant was genuinely apologetic, admitted he'd been speeding, and didn't try to pull rank or intimidate the officer. West gave him a warning the first time. The next day, Grant was caught speeding again, and Officer West actually arrested him, took him to the police station, and issued a citation. Grant posted a $20 bond and never showed up for court, forfeiting the bond instead. The whole incident says something oddly charming about Grant. He genuinely enjoyed riding fast and didn't think being president exempted him from traffic laws. West, meanwhile, kept his job and was reportedly respected for treating everyone equally, even the commander in chief. But Grant wasn't the only president with impressive memory skills. One president gave his entire inaugural address from memory. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history on March 4th, 1841, speaking for nearly 2 hours in cold, wet weather without a coat or hat. The speech was over 8,500 words, and he delivered the entire thing from memory, which is genuinely impressive regardless of the content. Unfortunately, this decision may have killed him. Harrison caught pneumonia shortly after the inauguration, though modern historians debate whether the speech itself was the cause or just bad timing. Either way, he died 31 days into his presidency, making him the shortest serving president in history. The inaugural address was packed with references to Roman history and republics, which Harrison apparently felt were crucial to share despite the freezing rain. He wanted to prove he was vigorous and intellectually sharp at age 68, the oldest president elected at that time. Instead, he proved that sometimes shorter is better. His vice president, John Tyler, became president unexpectedly, inheriting a job he hadn't really prepared for. But at least Harrison's legacy is memorable, unlike his funeral, which was interrupted by something unforgettable. A president's funeral was disrupted by a parrot swearing loudly. Andrew Jackson's funeral in 1845 was a somber, dignified affair attended by thousands of mourners. Then his pet parrot, Paul, started swearing loudly enough that they had to remove the bird from the service. Jackson had owned Paul for years, and apparently the parrot had learned an impressive vocabulary of profanity from Old Hickory himself. Witnesses reported the bird shouting curses and obscenities during the funeral, disturbing the grieving attendees. Reverend William Normant, who officiated the service, later described the parrot as uttering such utterances as would shame the reputation of any Christian. They eventually escorted Paul out so the service could continue in peace. It's a perfect Andrew Jackson story. Even his pet caused chaos. The parrot presumably lived on, continuing to swear at anyone nearby, a feathered memorial to Jackson's colorful language. It's almost poetic that Jackson's final public appearance was disrupted by a bird screaming insults. Though Jackson embraced chaos, not every president appreciated fun in the White House. One president banned dancing in the White House. James K. Polk and his wife, Sarah, were devout Presbyterians who disapproved of dancing, card playing, and most forms of entertainment they considered frivolous. When they moved into the White House in 1845, Sarah Polk instituted a strict ban on dancing at all official functions. White House parties became notably somber affairs, with no music, no dancing, and very little joy. The guests stood around making polite conversation while silently mourning the absence of fun. Foreign diplomats found it baffling. Washingtonians called the Polk White House the most boring social scene in the Capitol. Sarah defended the policy, arguing that the president's house should reflect dignity and seriousness, not frivolity. Polk himself worked obsessively, rarely taking breaks, and apparently believed everyone else should do the same. The ban lasted his entire term. When Polk left office in 1849, his successor Zachary Taylor immediately brought music and dancing back, and Washington collectively exhaled. Polk achieved significant policy goals during his presidency, expanding U.S. territory considerably, but his social events were reportedly unbearable. Still, at least he was average height, unlike one particularly short commander-in-chief. The shortest president was barely over 5 feet tall. James Madison stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall, making him the shortest president in U.S. history. He weighed roughly 100 pounds for most of his adult life, a fact that made him appear even smaller. Madison was frequently described as frail and soft-spoken. Not exactly the imposing figure you'd expect from the father of the Constitution. His wife, Dolly Madison, was taller than him, which contemporary accounts occasionally mentioned with barely concealed amusement. Despite his small stature, Madison was intellectually formidable, a brilliant political theorist who shaped American government more than most presidents twice his size. He served 2 terms, led the country through the War of 1812, and retired to Virginia, respected and admired. His height became a historical footnote, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to his legacy. Still, it's hard not to picture cabinet meetings where Madison had to look up at nearly everyone in the room. He proved that physical presence and leadership ability are completely unrelated, which is reassuring for everyone. And speaking of Madison, his relationship with voting was complicated. One president never voted in a presidential election. Zachary Taylor never voted in a presidential election before becoming president himself in 1848. He'd spent his entire adult life in the military, moving frequently between remote frontier posts where voting wasn't practical or possible. He had no fixed legal residence for most of his career, which made voter registration complicated. Taylor also claimed he'd never been particularly interested in politics until he was nominated for president. He'd never held elected office, never campaigned for anyone, and apparently never felt strongly enough about any candidate to make the effort to vote. Then the Whig Party nominated him based on his military fame, and suddenly he was running for president without ever having participated in democracy as a voter. He won, served for 16 months, and died of acute gastroenteritis in 1850, having voted for himself but never for anyone else. It's a weird footnote. The man who became commander-in-chief had never bothered to vote for commander-in-chief. Democracy is flexible that way. And speaking of presidential bodies causing problems, let's address the bathtub incident. A president got stuck in a bathtub, probably exaggerated, but based on real plumbing issues. The story that William Howard Taft got stuck in the White House bathtub is likely exaggerated, but it's rooted in truth. Taft weighed over 300 pounds and was genuinely too large for standard bathtubs of the era. After taking office in 1909, he had a custom bathtub installed that could fit 4 normal-sized men, which is both practical and slightly sad. Contemporary newspapers reported on the bathtub installation, making jokes about the president's size. Whether Taft actually got stuck in a tub before the new one was installed is unclear. No first-hand accounts confirm it, but it's plausible enough that the story persists. What's definitely true is that standard plumbing wasn't built for a man of Taft's size, and modifications were necessary. Taft was self-conscious about his weight, struggled with dieting throughout his life, and was reportedly much happier after leaving the presidency and becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The bathtub story is mostly myth, but the underlying reality, that Taft's size required special accommodations, is documented and true. And speaking of presidents with unique backgrounds, one didn't grow up speaking English. One president spoke English as a second language. Martin Van Buren grew up in Kinderhook, New York, in a Dutch-speaking community. His first language was Dutch, and he didn't learn English fluently until he attended school. Even as president, Van Buren occasionally spoke Dutch at home and with old friends from Kinderhook. He's the only U.S. president whose first language wasn't English, which makes him a unique figure in American history. Van Buren's bilingualism rarely came up during his political career, but it shaped his early education and worldview. By the time he entered politics, his English was polished and sophisticated, showing no trace of an accent, but Dutch remained his native tongue. Kinderhook was a deeply Dutch area in the early 1800s, and Van Buren's upbringing reflected that cultural heritage. He served one term as president from 1837 to 1841, dealing mostly with economic panic and financial crisis, neither of which required Dutch. Still, It's fascinating that America's eighth president grew up speaking a different language entirely. And speaking of presidents behaving oddly, some had a reputation for napping through important meetings. Several presidents regularly slept during cabinet meetings. Calvin Coolidge was famous for sleeping constantly. He reportedly slept 10 to 11 hours a night, plus naps, and occasionally dozed off during cabinet meetings, which must have been awkward for everyone else in the room. Coolidge believed in rest as a governing philosophy, arguing that most problems solved themselves if you just waited long enough. His vice president, Charles Dawes, once fell asleep during a crucial Senate vote, missing the chance to break a tie, which cost Coolidge a political appointment. So, sleeping in office was apparently contagious in the Coolidge administration. Ronald Reagan also reportedly napped during meetings in the 1980s, though his staff politely framed it as resting his eyes. Whether this was age, exhaustion, or just boredom is unclear, but multiple witnesses confirmed it happened. Governing is tiring, and apparently, some presidents dealt with it by just sleeping through parts of the job. Coolidge, at least, was honest about it, treating sleep as a legitimate presidential activity. But at least he didn't work himself to death immediately after leaving office, unlike one unfortunate former president. One president worked himself to death within months of leaving office. James K. Polk left the presidency in March 1849, exhausted after 4 years of nonstop work. He'd achieved every major goal he set, expanded U.S. territory dramatically, and rarely took a day off during his entire term. Polk was only 53, but looked much older, worn down by stress and constant labor. 3 months after leaving office, he died of cholera, likely weakened by years of overwork and inadequate rest. His final diary entries mentioned feeling unwell, but determined to keep working anyway, even in retirement. Polk's widow Sarah lived another 42 years, which makes his early death even more tragic. He worked himself into an early grave, literally, achieving his political goals but sacrificing his health entirely. Modern historians speculate that Polk's relentless work ethic contributed significantly to his rapid decline. He's remembered as one of the most effective one-term presidents, but also as a cautionary tale about burnout. At least Polk never gambled away government property, unlike another memorable commander-in-chief. A president once lost the White House china in a poker game. This story is often attributed to Warren G. Harding, who loved poker and hosted regular games in the White House during the early 1920s. Harding was reportedly a mediocre player who frequently lost, sometimes betting items he didn't technically own, including White House china. One legend claims he bet an entire set of historic china and lost, though the details are murky and possibly exaggerated. What's definitely true is that Harding played poker multiple times a week, often with friends and cabinet members, and wasn't particularly good at it. He treated the games as social events rather than serious gambling, but still managed to lose often enough that people noticed. Whether he actually lost White House china specifically is debated, but it's plausible given his casual attitude toward both poker and presidential property. Harding's presidency was marked by scandals involving his friends and appointees, so losing china in a card game fits the overall pattern of poor judgment. At least he could write a decent letter, unlike some presidents. One president wrote love letters filled with spelling errors. Andrew Jackson's love letters to his wife Rachel are passionate, sincere, and absolutely riddled with spelling and grammar errors. Jackson had limited formal education and never quite mastered spelling, even as president. His letters are endearing in their earnestness, but objectively difficult to read. He spelled phonetically, ignored punctuation, and occasionally invented words. Rachel apparently didn't mind, and their marriage was genuinely affectionate, despite Jackson's creative approach to written English. Historians reading Jackson's correspondence have to decipher sentences that barely follow standard rules. But the emotional content is clear. he adored his wife. Rachel died shortly before Jackson's inauguration in 1829, and he never remarried, keeping her memory central to his life. His letters to her remain in archives, proof that you don't need perfect spelling to express love, though it certainly helps with clarity. Jackson's inability to spell didn't stop him from becoming president, which is either inspiring or concerning depending on your perspective. But at least Jackson had access to a bathtub, unlike earlier presidents. A president installed the first permanent bathtub at the White House. Millard Fillmore had the first permanent bathtub installed in the White House in 1851. Before that, presidents bathed using portable tubs filled by hand with water heated on the stove, which sounds exhausting and inconvenient. Fillmore saw modern plumbing as a necessity, not a luxury, and pushed for upgrades to the White House infrastructure. The new bathtub was connected to running water, heated by a new boiler system, and represented cutting-edge technology for the time. Some people mocked Fillmore for this, calling it an extravagant waste of money, but he correctly argued that the president's residence should have basic modern amenities. The bathtub installation was part of larger plumbing renovations that made the White House significantly more livable. Fillmore wasn't a particularly memorable president politically, serving only 2 years after Zachary Taylor's sudden death, but his bathtub legacy endured. Every president since has benefited from his insistence on indoor plumbing, even if they don't realize it. And speaking of surprising legacies, one president's descendants lived well into the modern era. One president had living grandsons in the 21st century. John Tyler, who served as president from 1841 to 1845, had 2 living grandsons as of 2023. Yes, grandsons, not great-great-great-grandsons. This sounds impossible, but the math works due to the Tyler family having children very late in life across multiple generations. Tyler was born in 1790. He had a son, Lyon Gardner Tyler, when he was 63. Lyon then had 2 sons when he was in his 70s in the 1920s. Those sons, Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr. and Harrison Ruffin Tyler, were still alive in the 21st century, making them the direct grandsons of a president born in the 18th century. It's a bizarre historical overlap, proof that the past isn't as distant as we think. Imagine being alive in the internet age while your grandfather was president before the Civil War. The Tyler family tree is a reminder that generational gaps can stretch surprisingly wide, connecting eras that seem impossibly far apart. And speaking of presidents with unusual habits, one refused to shake hands entirely. A president refused to shake hands, preferring formal bows. Thomas Jefferson thought handshaking was too casual and informal for the President of the United States. Instead, he preferred to greet people with formal bows, which he considered more dignified and egalitarian, ironically. Jefferson believed handshakes were too familiar and implied social hierarchy, since in European courts, who offered their hand first mattered. Bowing, he reasoned, was more democratic because everyone bowed the same way regardless of rank. His guests found this baffling and occasionally awkward, but Jefferson insisted on it throughout his presidency. He hosted informal dinners where he served food himself rather than using servants, dressed casually, and generally rejected formality, except for the handshake thing, which he refused to do. It's a strange contradiction. Jefferson wanted to be seen as a man of the people, but wouldn't shake their hands. Eventually, later presidents brought handshaking back as standard practice, and bowing fell out of favor. Now handshakes are expected, and bowing would seem strange, the opposite of Jefferson's era. But at least Jefferson enjoyed his job, unlike some presidents who hated campaigning entirely. Several presidents openly hated campaigning. Calvin Coolidge despised campaigning and avoided it whenever possible. He ran for re-election in 1924, essentially by doing nothing, staying in the White House and letting his reputation handle the work. His campaign slogan was "Keep cool with Coolidge," which sounds dynamic, but mostly meant leave me alone. I'm governing. Coolidge won easily, proving you don't need enthusiasm to win if the economy is good. William Howard Taft also hated campaigning, finding it undignified and exhausting. He preferred staying home, writing letters, and hoping people would vote for him based on his record. Both men saw campaigning as a necessary evil rather than an opportunity, which feels refreshingly honest. Modern presidential campaigns last year's and require constant public performance, which would have horrified Coolidge and Taft. They believed the presidency should speak for itself, that personal charisma was less important than competence. Whether that's true is debatable, but their distaste for campaigning was genuine. At least they never faced death by dairy, unlike one particularly unlucky president. One president was nearly killed by cheese, literally. In 1835, a New York farmer named Thomas Meacham decided to honor President Andrew Jackson by creating an enormous wheel of cheese weighing 1,400 pounds. He aged it for 2 years, then delivered it to the White House in 1837 as a gift. Jackson, not knowing what else to do with 1,400 pounds of cheese, left it in the White House foyer and invited the public to come eat it. On February 22nd, 1837, thousands of people swarmed the White House, devouring the entire cheese wheel in 2 hours. The smell was reportedly unbearable for weeks afterward, embedded in carpets, curtains, and walls. Cleaning crews scrubbed for months. The cheese itself wasn't dangerous, but the crowd could have been. Thousands of people crammed into the White House in an uncontrolled mob is a security nightmare. Jackson wasn't injured, but the chaos was real. The cheese incident became legendary in Washington, a reminder that sometimes good intentions result in a house that smells like rotting dairy for half a year. And speaking of unusual presidential pets, one had a very memorable name. A president's dog was named Satan. John Adams owned a dog named Satan, which is an interesting choice for a founding father. Adams also had other dogs with more conventional names, but Satan apparently stood out enough to be recorded in historical documents. Whether Adams named the dog ironically or literally believed the dog had demonic qualities is unclear, but either way, it's memorable. Imagine White House staff calling for Satan in the hallways, summoning a dog instead of, the devil. Presidential pets have included everything from alligators to raccoons, so a dog named Satan barely registers as strange by comparison. Adams kept Satan during his presidency from 1797 to 1801, and the dog presumably lived a normal, non-demonic life. The name choice suggests Adams had a sense of humor, which is nice to imagine given his reputation as serious and occasionally cranky. Satan the dog is a footnote in presidential pet history, but a memorable one. Though speaking of memorable moments, one president's swearing in was wildly unconventional. One president was sworn in aboard an airplane. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One on November 22nd, 1963, just hours after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. It was the first and only time a president took the oath of office on an airplane. Judge Sarah T. Hughes administered the oath in the plane's cramped cabin, with Jackie Kennedy standing beside Johnson, still wearing the blood-stained pink suit from earlier that day. The swearing-in was rushed, somber, and improvised, happening on the ground at Love Field before the plane took off for Washington. A photographer captured the moment, and the image is haunting. Johnson with his hand raised, surrounded by stunned aides and Secret Service agents, everyone processing shock and grief while trying to maintain constitutional continuity. The whole ceremony took less than 2 minutes. Then Air Force One departed, carrying Kennedy's body in the rear and Johnson, now president, in the front. It's one of the darkest moments in American history, made stranger by the surreal location. But at least Johnson answered the phone like a normal person, unlike one particular president. A president once answered the phone, ahoy. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, believed ahoy should be the standard telephone greeting. Thomas Edison pushed for hello instead, and hello eventually won, but for a while the greeting was genuinely debated. Rutherford B. Hayes, who was president when the telephone was first installed in the White House in 1879, reportedly answered the phone with ahoy at least once, following Bell's preferred convention. The first phone call to the White House came from the Treasury Department, about 13 blocks away, testing whether the new technology actually worked. Hayes picked up and said something. Accounts vary on whether it was ahoy or just confusion, because nobody really knew phone etiquette yet. The whole concept of talking to someone miles away through a wire was bizarre and new. Hayes was fascinated by technology and had the phone installed despite skepticism from his staff. Hello eventually became standard, but for a brief moment, ahoy was a real contender, and the President of the United States might have been saying it. Which brings us from presidential oddities to military absurdities, because things are about to get even stranger. The US almost went to war with Britain over a pig in 1859. An American farmer on San Juan Island shot a British pig that was eating his potatoes. This pig-related property dispute nearly triggered a war between the United States and Britain. The island's ownership was disputed, with both American and British settlers claiming it. When Lyman Cutler killed the pig belonging to an Irishman working for the Hudson's Bay Company, British authorities threatened to arrest him. American settlers called for military protection. The U.S. sent 60 soldiers. Britain responded with 3 warships and 2,000 men. For weeks, American and British forces faced off over a dead pig. Both sides prepared for combat. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Rear Admiral Robert Baines refused to engage, reportedly saying he wouldn't involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. The crisis de-escalated, and the 2 countries eventually agreed to joint military occupation until the border dispute was settled 12 years later. The Pig War, as it's now called, had exactly 1 casualty. The pig. It's possibly the most absurd near war in history, proof that international incidents can start over anything. But at least that conflict lasted a while. One war was over almost instantly. The shortest war in U.S. history lasted less than an hour. The shortest military engagement involving U.S. forces happened during the Grenada invasion in 1983, though the entire operation took days. However, if we're talking about declared wars, the Spanish-American War saw several battles that lasted under an hour. The Battle of Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, lasted roughly 7 hours, but individual skirmishes were far shorter. Some military historians point to various brief engagements during the Indian Wars where conflicts lasted minutes. But the most commonly cited shortest war involving any nation is the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, which lasted 38 to 45 minutes. Though the U.S. wasn't involved, America's briefest military actions were typically raids or surgical strikes lasting minutes to hours rather than sustained campaigns. Modern drone strikes can be over in seconds. The point is that warfare isn't always prolonged. Sometimes it's shockingly quick, but speed doesn't make it less serious. Just more efficient and occasionally absurd. And speaking of military absurdity, the Army once imported some very unexpected animals. The U.S. Army once tested camels in the American Southwest in 1855. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis convinced Congress to fund the U.S. Camel Corps, importing 77 camels from the Middle East to test their effectiveness in the arid Southwest. The logic was sound. Camels handle heat and desert terrain better than horses. They arrived in Texas, and the Army began experimenting with them for transportation and cargo. The camels actually worked quite well. They could carry more weight, needed less water, and tolerated heat that exhausted horses. But the soldiers hated them. Camels are temperamental, they spit, they smell, and they scared the horses, causing chaos in camps. When the Civil War started in 1861, the camel experiment was abandoned. Most camels were sold at auction, some escaped into the wild, and for decades afterward, people reported seeing feral camels wandering the Southwest, descendants of the Army's abandoned experiment. The last confirmed wild camel sighting was in 1891. The camel corps was a reasonable idea that failed entirely due to personality conflicts between species, which feels very American. But camels weren't the only military experiment that went sideways. A Civil War general became famous for refusing to retreat while lost. During the Civil War, General Ambrose Burnside became legendary for his stubbornness, particularly during the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against fortified Confederate positions, suffering massive Union casualties while gaining no ground. He refused to retreat or change tactics, insisting his plan would work despite overwhelming evidence otherwise. The battle was a disaster, and Burnside was eventually removed from command. The irony is that Burnside's determination was often praised as courage, even when it was clearly just bad judgment. He wasn't technically lost during Fredericksburg, but his refusal to adapt or retreat made him infamous. Burnside is now better remembered for his facial hairstyle, sideburns which are literally named after him, than for his military competence. His legacy is a reminder that stubbornness isn't the same as bravery, and sometimes retreating is the smart move. But Burnside kept pushing forward, convinced he was right, and thousands of soldiers died because of it. At least the soldiers themselves got compensated, even if sometimes the payment was questionable. Soldiers were once paid in alcohol rations. For much of early American military history, soldiers received daily alcohol rations as part of their pay. Rum, whiskey, or beer was standard issue, considered necessary for morale and health. The daily ration was typically a gill of whiskey, about 4 ounces, which doesn't sound like much until you realize it was every single day. Soldiers drank it straight or mixed with water, called grog, which made it marginally less potent. The practice continued through the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and into the Civil War era, though it became less common over time. Military leaders eventually recognized that giving soldiers alcohol daily might contribute to discipline problems, injuries, and general chaos. The ration was phased out gradually, though it persisted in some units well into the 1860s. Imagine modern military personnel being issued whiskey shots as part of their wages. It's hard to picture, but for early American soldiers, it was normal. At least alcohol rations were intentional. Some military disasters were purely accidental, like the time the Army bombed itself. The US military accidentally bombed itself during training exercises. Military training accidents happen, but one of the more spectacular incidents occurred during World War II when the Army Air Forces accidentally bombed a small town in Florida. On October 23, 1943, a B-17 bomber crew was practicing over the Gulf of Mexico when they accidentally released their bombs over Boca Raton instead of the designated target range offshore. The bombs hit a residential area, damaging homes and terrifying residents, though miraculously nobody was killed. The crew had simply made a navigation error, mistaking land for water. Similar accidents happened throughout the war as inexperienced pilots trained over U.S. territory. Ships fired on each other during exercises, planes dropped ordnance in the wrong places, and training missions sometimes caused more casualties than enemy action. The military learned valuable lessons from these mistakes, mostly about the importance of clear communication and better navigation training. But the fact that an American bomber crew accidentally attacked Florida remains a perfect example of how training exercises can go catastrophically wrong. And speaking of buildings with quirks, the Pentagon has its own strange design story. The Pentagon has twice as many bathrooms as originally needed. When the Pentagon was built during World War II, Virginia was still segregated, requiring separate bathrooms for white and black workers. So the building was designed with twice as many restrooms as functionally necessary, essentially duplicating facilities throughout the massive structure. By the time construction finished in 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt had ordered the Pentagon integrated, making half the bathrooms redundant immediately. But the extra bathrooms remained. And now the Pentagon has far more restrooms per person than any comparable office building. It's a permanent architectural reminder of segregation, built into the structure of the military's headquarters. The Pentagon already holds records for size. It's one of the world's largest office buildings, but it also holds the unofficial record for most unnecessary bathrooms. Walking through the Pentagon today, you're navigating a building designed around a discriminatory system that was already being dismantled before construction ended. The extra bathrooms are a historical artifact, embedded in concrete and still in use. But bathrooms weren't the only unusual Pentagon-era idea. The military had much stranger weapons concepts. During World War II, the U.S. briefly considered exploding bats as weapons. The U.S. military genuinely developed a plan to use bats as incendiary weapons against Japan during World War II. The concept, proposed by dental surgeon Lytle Adams, involved attaching tiny napalm bombs to bats, releasing them over Japanese cities, and letting the bats roost in wooden buildings before the timers detonated. It sounds absurd, but the military took it seriously. The program was called Project X-Ray, approved in 1942. Researchers captured thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats and conducted tests. The plan mostly worked. Bats did roost in buildings, and the tiny incendiary devices did start fires. But the project was expensive, unpredictable, and ultimately unnecessary once the atomic bomb became available. One test went wrong when armed bats escaped and set fire to a military base in New Mexico, which probably should have been a sign. Project X-Ray was canceled in 1944, and the bats were released. It remains one of the stranger weapons programs in U.S. history, proof that wartime desperation breeds creative thinking, even if that thinking involves militarizing wildlife. But bats weren't the only creatures caught up in war. A submarine once sank a train on July 30th, 1945. The USS Barb, an American submarine operating in Japanese waters, surfaced near the coast and fired rockets at a Japanese coastal train. The attack successfully destroyed the train, making the Barb the only submarine in history to sink a train, which is technically accurate even if it sounds impossible. The Barb's crew had been conducting coastal raids, targeting infrastructure along the Japanese shoreline. They spotted the train moving along tracks near the beach, calculated the timing, and fired a barrage of rockets that derailed and destroyed the locomotive. The crew celebrated, claiming credit for the most unlikely naval victory imaginable. Submarines are designed to sink ships, not trains, but the Barb's crew improvised brilliantly. The incident was officially recorded and later verified. The train attack was part of a larger series of raids that demonstrated how submarines could operate in shallow coastal waters, threatening land-based targets. It's a testament to creative tactical thinking, though it's hard to imagine the train engineer's confusion when his locomotive was hit by submarine fire. But sometimes the military didn't just lose battles, they lost entire nuclear weapons. The Navy lost a nuclear bomb and never found it. On February 5th, 1958, a B-47 bomber carrying a Mark 15 nuclear bomb collided with an F-86 fighter jet during a training mission off the coast of Georgia. The B-47 was damaged, and the crew decided to jettison the nuclear weapon into the water near Tybee Island to reduce weight for an emergency landing. They dropped the bomb into Wassaw Sound, a coastal waterway near Savannah. The crew landed safely. The bomb was never recovered. The military searched for weeks, using boats, divers, and detection equipment, but the muddy, shifting underwater terrain made recovery impossible. The bomb is still there, somewhere in the coastal waters off Georgia, lost since 1958. The military insists it doesn't contain the plutonium core necessary for a nuclear explosion, so it's not an active nuclear threat, just a very expensive, very radioactive object sitting on the ocean floor. The Taibbi bomb remains one of several broken arrows, military terminology for lost nuclear weapons, and a reminder that even the most important military equipment can simply disappear. At least paint-related experiments were less permanently dangerous. The Army once tried using glow-in-the-dark paint on ships. During World War I, the military experimented with painting ships using luminous paint containing radium, hoping it would help with nighttime visibility and navigation. The idea was that ships could see each other in the dark without using lights that would attract enemy submarines. Radium paint glows faintly in darkness, so theoretically it made sense. In practice, it was a terrible idea. Radium is radioactive and extremely dangerous. The paint exposed sailors to radiation, caused health problems, and didn't even glow brightly enough to be useful for navigation. The experiment was quickly abandoned once the dangers became apparent, but not before several ships were coated with radioactive paint. Some of that paint remained for years, slowly poisoning anyone who came into contact with it. The radium paint incidents were part of a larger pattern of early 20th century industries using radioactive materials without understanding the health risks. Radium was in watches, cosmetics, and even food products before its dangers were fully recognized. The glowing ships are a reminder that innovation without safety testing can be catastrophic, but at least radium paint was more dangerous than bicycles, which the Army also tested. Soldiers were issued bicycles for warfare experiments. In the late 1800s, the U.S. Army experimented with bicycle infantry, testing whether soldiers on bicycles could move faster than those on foot or horseback. The 25th Infantry Regiment, a unit of African American soldiers known as Buffalo Soldiers, conducted a famous test ride in 1897, cycling from Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri, covering nearly 2,000 miles in 40 days. The experiment aimed to prove bicycles were viable for military transportation. The soldiers succeeded, arriving in St. Louis exhausted, but having demonstrated bicycles could handle rough terrain and long distances. However, the Army ultimately decided bicycles were impractical for combat. They required maintained roads, couldn't cross rough terrain as well as horses, and left soldiers exposed and vulnerable. The bicycle infantry experiment was shelved, and horses remained the primary transportation method until motorized vehicles became common. Still, the bicycle corps demonstrated impressive endurance and adaptability, proving the concept could work even if it wasn't adopted. And speaking of military operations interrupted by unexpected distractions, one battle stopped for snacks. A Civil War battle was delayed because soldiers stopped to pick berries. During the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, Union soldiers advancing through Virginia stopped to pick blackberries growing along the roadside. It was summer, the berries were ripe, and many soldiers were young and inexperienced, treating the march like a countryside outing rather than a combat mission. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as troops broke formation to gather fruit. The delay contributed to the Union's disorganization during the battle, which they ultimately lost. The berry picking incident became a symbol of the Union Army's early unpreparedness, illustrating how Green troops didn't fully understand the seriousness of war. Civilians had even followed the Army, bringing picnic baskets to watch the battle, expecting a quick Union victory and entertainment. Instead, they witnessed a chaotic defeat and fled in panic alongside retreating soldiers. The battle was a wake-up call for both the military and the public, showing that the Civil War would be long, brutal, and nothing like a summer picnic. The berry picking soldiers learned quickly that war doesn't pause for snacks, but at least those soldiers were human. The military also trained animals for combat support. The US once trained dogs to deliver medical supplies by parachute. During World War II, the military trained dogs to parachute with medical supplies and other cargo, dropping them behind enemy lines or into remote locations where human medics couldn't reach. The program trained hundreds of dogs to jump from aircraft wearing specially designed harnesses and parachutes. Dogs learned to stay calm during flight, tolerate the noise of aircraft engines, and land safely after deployment. Most jumped in tandem with handlers, but some were trained to jump solo with supply packs attached. The program was reasonably successful, proving dogs could be trained for airborne operations. However, the complexity and expense of training parachute dogs meant the program was limited and eventually phased out after the war. Still, dozens of dogs successfully completed jumps during combat operations, delivering crucial supplies to isolated units. The image of dogs parachuting into war zones sounds absurd, but it was a real, functional program that saved lives. Military working dogs have always been adaptable, but parachuting dogs remain one of the more surreal examples. And speaking of things that stayed where they landed, some battlefields have permanent reminders. A cannonball from a 19th century battle is still lodged in a church wall. The Charleston, South Carolina area has several buildings with cannonballs still embedded in walls from the Civil War. One famous example is the cannonball lodged in the wall of the Circular Congregational Church, fired during the Union bombardment of Charleston between 1863 and 1865. The cannonball hit the church but didn't explode, and it was never removed, remaining embedded in the brick for over 150 years. It's now a historical landmark, a physical scar from the war that visitors can see and touch. Similar cannonballs remain lodged in buildings throughout Charleston and other Civil War sites, too dangerous or too historically significant to remove. Some are from the Revolutionary War, even older, embedded in walls since the 1700s. These cannonballs are time capsules, frozen reminders of violence that literally became part of the architecture. The church in Charleston kept its cannonball deliberately, choosing to preserve the damage as a memorial rather than repair it. It's a strange kind of monument, a weapon that failed to detonate but succeeded in staying visible forever. Though sometimes military failures were about water instead of walls. A U.S. ship once sank because its doors were left open. The USS Indianapolis sank in July of 1945 after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, killing nearly 900 men. But many ships have sunk due to simpler causes, like open doors. The HMS Captain, a British ship, capsized in 1870 because of poor design and open gun ports. Several U.S. Navy ships have sunk or nearly sank during storms because hatches and doors weren't properly sealed. The most famous American example might be the USS Wisconsin, which nearly sank during a typhoon in 1945 when crew members failed to secure a door, allowing water to flood multiple compartments. The ship survived but came dangerously close to going down. Water flooding through the open doors is a constant naval danger, and it's happened repeatedly throughout history. Modern ships have better designs and protocols, but the fundamental problem remains. If you leave doors open on a ship, water comes in, and eventually the ship sinks. It's simple physics, but it's caused countless disasters. At least open doors are obvious. Some military honors went to creatures nobody expected. Military pigeons received medals during both World Wars. The U.S. military used carrier pigeons to deliver messages across battlefields, especially when radio communication failed. Some pigeons became famous for successfully delivering crucial messages under fire. Cher Ami, a pigeon in World War I, delivered a message that saved nearly 200 soldiers of the Lost Battalion in 1918, despite being shot and severely wounded. Cher Ami lost an eye and a leg, but completed the mission and was awarded the French Croix de Guerre Medal for heroism. The pigeon was later mounted and displayed at the Smithsonian. Another famous pigeon, G.I. Joe, saved over 1,000 British troops in World War II by delivering a message that called off an Allied bombing raid just in time. G.I. Joe received the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of a military decoration. Dozens of military pigeons received medals and commendations for bravery, which sounds absurd until you realize these birds genuinely saved lives by flying through gunfire and explosions to deliver information. Pigeons were some of the most reliable message carriers in both wars, but not every war ended through heroism. Sometimes it ended through sheer bureaucratic failure. A war ended because someone forgot to send a message. Several conflicts throughout history have ended awkwardly due to communication failures, but one notable example involves the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814, officially ending the war between the United States and Britain. However, news traveled slowly across the Atlantic. The Battle of New Orleans was fought on January 8th, 1815, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Because neither side knew the war was over, Andrew Jackson led American forces to a decisive victory against the British, killing or wounding over 2,000 British soldiers while suffering minimal American casualties. The battle made Jackson a national hero and launched his political career, even though it was completely unnecessary. Had communication been faster, the battle would never have happened. The soldiers who died at New Orleans fell in a war that had already ended, victims of slow mail delivery. It's a tragic reminder that information speed matters in war, and that battles fought after peace treaties are signed still cause very real casualties. But at least those soldiers were trying to fight. Some surrenders happened entirely by accident. A fort surrendered without a single shot fired. By accident, Fort Detroit surrendered to British forces in August 1812 without a fight, despite having superior numbers and supplies. General William Hull, commanding American forces, became convinced the British had far more troops and Native American allies than they actually did. He feared a massacre if he resisted, particularly worrying about civilian casualties. So Hull surrendered the fort, handing over the entire garrison, supplies, and control of Detroit without firing a shot. His soldiers were furious. Many wanted to fight, but Hull overruled them. It turned out the British were bluffing, using deception to make their forces seem larger. Hull's surrender was one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. military history. He was later court-martialed for cowardice and sentenced to death, though President Madison commuted the sentence. Hull spent the rest of his life defending his decision, arguing he saved lives by surrendering. Whether he was a coward or a pragmatist depends on your perspective, but either way, Fort Detroit fell without resistance, a surrender based entirely on fear rather than defeat. And sometimes military ambitions were too grand, leading to literal structural collapse. The U.S. once planned a parade so large it collapsed roads. After World War I ended in November 1918, American cities held massive victory parades to celebrate returning soldiers. New York City's parade was particularly ambitious, with thousands of troops, vehicles, and spectators crowding the streets. The sheer weight of military equipment, including tanks and heavy artillery, caused sections of pavement to crack and buckle under the load. Some roads literally couldn't support the weight of the parade, forcing organizers to reroute sections mid-event. Similar problems occurred in other cities hosting large victory parades where aging infrastructure couldn't handle modern military equipment. Tanks designed to cross battlefields weren't designed with urban road weight limits in mind. The collapsed pavement became a metaphor for post-war transition. Military power returning home to a civilian world not quite built for it. Cities learned to reinforce parade routes for future events, but that first round of post-war celebrations genuinely broke roads. It's a strange problem to have, infrastructure collapsing under the weight of celebration, but it happened repeatedly across America in 1918 and 1919. But roads weren't the only thing breaking. The legal system had its own absurdities, starting with tomatoes. Congress once ruled tomatoes were vegetables for tax purposes. In 1893, the Supreme Court heard Nix versus Hedden, a case about whether tomatoes were fruits or vegetables. This wasn't philosophical curiosity, it was about import taxes. The Tariff Act of 1883 imposed taxes on imported vegetables, but not fruits. John Nix imported tomatoes and argued they were fruits, botanically speaking, and therefore tax exempt. The government disagreed, claiming tomatoes were vegetables based on common usage. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that tomatoes are vegetables for tax purposes, despite being botanically classified as fruits. Justice Horace Gray wrote that tomatoes are usually served at dinner in, with, or after the soup, fish, or meats, and not as dessert, therefore vegetables. It's a perfect example of law ignoring science when money's involved. Botanists still correctly call tomatoes fruits, but legally, they're vegetables because Congress needed tax revenue. The ruling stands today, making tomatoes officially both, depending on who's asking. But contradictory rulings weren't limited to produce. The US has laws that contradict each other simultaneously. Federal and state laws sometimes directly contradict each other, creating legal gray zones. Marijuana is the most obvious current example. It's illegal federally under the Controlled Substances Act, but legal for recreational or medical use in many states. This creates situations where someone can be simultaneously breaking federal law and complying with state law. Banking is complicated because federally chartered banks can't work with marijuana businesses without violating federal law, even in states where it's legal. Similar contradictions exist with gun laws, environmental regulations, and other areas where federal and state authority overlap. Technically, federal law supersedes state law under the Supremacy Clause, but enforcement is inconsistent. States often ignore federal law when they disagree, and the federal government often lacks resources to enforce uniformly. The result is a patchwork legal system where your rights and restrictions depend on geography and which government is paying attention. It's messy, confusing, and somehow functional. And speaking of legal confusion, mailing food had unexpected complications. It was once illegal to mail potatoes by parcel post until people did it anyway. When the U.S. Postal Service introduced parcel post in 1913, they created rules about what could be mailed. Living creatures, hazardous materials, and perishable goods had restrictions. Technically, mailing children was illegal, though some parents tested this. But one farmer discovered a loophole: mailing yourself. In 1914, people began mailing potatoes, eggs, and even livestock using parcel post because it was cheaper than freight. The Postal Service tried to stop it, creating regulations, but enforcement was inconsistent. One family famously mailed their baby to grandma's house, paying 15 cents in postage and having the mail carrier deliver the child. The Postal Service eventually tightened rules, explicitly banning mailing humans and restricting perishables. But for a brief period, Americans mailed everything imaginable, including themselves, exploiting unclear regulations. It's a reminder that every law exists because someone did something ridiculous first. And sometimes the government's organizational structure was equally ridiculous. The government accidentally created two agencies with overlapping jobs. Throughout U.S. history, bureaucratic overlap has been common, but some examples are spectacular. The Drug Enforcement Administration and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives both handle drug-related crimes with overlapping jurisdiction, causing turf battles and confusion. The Department of Homeland Security absorbed 22 agencies, many with overlapping responsibilities that were never fully consolidated. During World War II, multiple agencies handled propaganda and information, sometimes contradicting each other publicly. The most absurd might be intelligence agencies. The CIA, NSA, DIA, FBI, and others all gather intelligence, often duplicating efforts and occasionally withholding information from each other. Congress periodically tries to streamline government, eliminating redundancy, but it rarely works. Agencies defend their turf, Congress protects favorite programs, and overlap persists. The result is a government that sometimes investigates itself, regulates itself, and argues with itself. It's inefficient, but also provides checks and balances, even if accidentally. But at least agencies exist. Some laws referenced places that didn't. One law remained on the books, even though it referenced a country that no longer existed. US legal code is filled with obsolete laws that were never formally repealed. Some reference countries that no longer exist, like the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, or Czechoslovakia. Trade regulations, diplomatic protocols, and immigration laws sometimes still mention dissolved nations because nobody bothered updating the language. Technically, these laws are meaningless. You can't enforce trade policy with a country that doesn't exist, but they remain in official legal code. Removing them requires congressional action, which is time consuming and low priority. So they stay legal artifacts of a different world. Some laws reference currencies that no longer exist or organizations that dissolved decades ago. Legal scholars occasionally catalog these obsolete provisions, but actually removing them is another matter entirely. The US legal system is layered with historical sediment, old laws buried under new ones, still technically valid until someone explicitly repeals them. It's legal archaeology, and nobody has time for it. And speaking of outdated regulations, margarine once required a license. Some states required licenses to sell margarine. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, dairy farmers lobbied heavily against margarine, seeing it as competition. Several states passed laws restricting or banning margarine sales entirely. Some required margarine to be dyed pink so consumers couldn't mistake it for butter. Others banned yellow margarine entirely, forcing manufacturers to sell it white with a packet of yellow dye for consumers to mix themselves. Wisconsin, a major dairy state, required licenses to sell margarine and taxed it heavily. The regulations were protectionist, designed to favor butter producers over margarine manufacturers. Some states didn't fully repeal anti-margarine laws until the 1960s. The last holdout was Wisconsin, which banned yellow margarine until 1967. Margarine won eventually, but it took decades of legal battles and changing attitudes. The regulations were never about health or safety, just economic protection for dairy farmers. It's a reminder that food regulations are often about politics. But at least margarine was trackable. Some government property just vanished. The federal government once lost track of entire buildings. The General Services Administration, responsible for managing federal property, has periodically conducted audits revealing they've lost track of buildings, land parcels, and other assets. In some cases, the government owns buildings nobody remembers acquiring, or property listed in records that doesn't actually exist. One audit in the 1990s found thousands of properties that were misclassified, abandoned, or simply forgotten. Federal agencies sometimes buy property, then lose the paperwork, leaving buildings vacant and unused, while still technically government-owned. Other times, agencies dissolve or merge, and their property records get lost in transition. The government owns millions of acres and thousands of buildings, so some getting lost in paperwork is almost inevitable, but it's still absurd. Imagine losing an entire building. It's sitting there, physical and real, but bureaucratically vanished. Periodically, someone discovers these lost properties, and the government decides what to do with buildings they forgot they owned. But buildings are at least stationary. Some entire towns disappeared from records. A town existed legally, but forgot to file paperwork. Throughout US history, small towns have occasionally been incorporated, then forgotten administratively. Residents continue living there, but the town isn't officially recognized in state records. This happens when incorporation paperwork is lost, filed incorrectly, or never completed properly. One example is Komakulshan, a utopian community in Washington that incorporated in 1905 but never filed proper paperwork. The town existed, had residents, and a post office, but legally wasn't a town. Eventually, the community dissolved, but for years it existed in a legal limbo. Similar cases happen when towns disincorporate but continue as unincorporated communities. Residents still live there, but the town isn't technically a town anymore. It's confusing for everyone involved, especially for taxes, services, and mail delivery. These phantom towns are reminders that bureaucracy and reality don't always align. And speaking of bureaucratic absurdities, Congress once debated banning something completely harmless. Congress once debated banning umbrellas. In the 1800s, umbrellas became popular in American cities, and some people hated them. Umbrellas were seen as effeminate or foreign, and street crowds found them annoying. When someone carried an umbrella through a crowded street, they poked people accidentally. Some cities considered banning umbrellas in public spaces during peak hours. Congress never formally debated a nationwide umbrella ban, but local ordinances restricted umbrella use in some areas. The complaints were safety related. Umbrellas blocked sightlines, poked eyes, and caused pedestrian congestion. Eventually, people adjusted, umbrella etiquette developed, and the bans were dropped. But for a brief period, umbrellas were genuinely controversial. It's hard to imagine now, but every common object was once new and suspicious. Umbrellas seem harmless today, but in the 1800s, they were seen as dangerous nuisances. Society adapts to new things slowly, often with regulatory panic first. And speaking of panic, sometimes the government caused economic problems by accident. The US accidentally created inflation by printing too much paper money. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederacy printed paper money to finance military operations. The Confederacy printed so much currency that it became essentially worthless by 1865, causing catastrophic inflation. The Union's greenbacks fared better, but still caused inflation. The government printed money without gold backing, flooding the economy with currency that decreased in value. Prices rose, wages stagnated, and inflation spiraled. After the war, the government tried to withdraw excess currency, causing economic contraction and deflation. It was an economic mess, oscillating between too much money and too little. The lesson was clear. Printing money without restraint causes inflation, destroying currency value. Modern economists understand this, but during the Civil War, it was learned through painful experience. The Confederacy's currency became collector's items, interesting historical artifacts, but monetarily worthless. The Union eventually stabilized its currency, but it took years. And sometimes the problem wasn't too much money, but illegible laws themselves. Some laws are written in handwriting no one can read. Early US laws were handwritten before typewriters existed, and some founding era documents are nearly illegible. The original copies of some state constitutions and laws are written in cursive that's difficult to decipher. Scholars spend years translating these documents, interpreting faded ink and archaic handwriting styles. Some laws passed in the 1700s and 1800s exist only in handwritten form, and when officials need to reference them, they face the challenge of reading script that barely resembles modern writing. Occasionally, Legal disputes hinge on interpreting a specific word or phrase in an old handwritten law, and experts debate what the letters actually spell. It's like legal archaeology combined with cryptography. Modern laws are typed and digitized, but historical statutes remain locked in handwriting that's increasingly hard to read as cursive education declines. We have laws on the books that most people literally can't read without specialized training. But at least laws stayed in place. Sometimes government agencies didn't. The IRS was temporarily shut down by snowstorms. In 1996, a massive blizzard hit Washington, D.C., shutting down the federal government for several days, including the IRS. Tax season deadlines didn't change, but processing stopped. It wasn't the first time weather disrupted government operations. In 1899, the blizzard of 1899 shut down much of the East Coast, halting mail delivery and government services for over a week. More recently, in 2016, snowstorms closed federal offices during tax season, creating backlogs. The IRS relies on physical mail and in-person processing, so when weather prevents employees from reaching offices or mail from being delivered, everything stops. Modern technology helps, online filing continues during weather shutdowns, but physical processing still requires humans in offices. It's a reminder that government operations depend on basic things like people being able to get to work. Even the most powerful government agency in America can be defeated by snow. And speaking of bureaucratic excess, some forms got absurd. One federal form was longer than the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, including amendments, is about 7,600 words. Some federal tax forms exceed that length. The instructions for Form 1040 and related schedules can run over 200 pages of dense text. Environmental impact statements required for large projects sometimes exceed 1,000 pages. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act regulations produce thousands of pages of implementation rules. Bureaucratic forms have grown exponentially, far exceeding the founding documents in length and complexity. The irony is obvious. The Constitution established the entire government structure in a document shorter than the instructions for filing certain tax returns. Legal complexity has grown alongside government size, and navigating modern federal bureaucracy requires significantly more reading than understanding the founding principles of the nation. It's simultaneously impressive and exhausting. The Constitution is concise and accessible. Federal regulations are encyclopedic and impenetrable. And sometimes congressional debates were equally convoluted. Congress once argued over whether Alaska was worth keeping. When the Secretary of State William Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million, many Americans thought it was a terrible idea. Critics called it Seward's folly and Seward's icebox, mocking the purchase of frozen wilderness. Congress debated whether to approve funding, with opponents arguing Alaska was worthless tundra with no economic value. The deal nearly failed. Eventually, Congress approved the purchase by a narrow margin, largely because refusing seemed diplomatically awkward after negotiations concluded. Alaska seemed worthless for decades. Then gold was discovered in the late 1890s, followed by oil in the 20th century. Alaska became one of the most resource-rich states in the nation, generating billions in revenue. Seward was vindicated posthumously, but during his lifetime, the Alaska Purchase was considered a political mistake. It's a reminder that judging long-term value is difficult, and sometimes the worst ideas turn out brilliantly. But not all government programs aged well, especially ones involving wildlife. The government paid people to kill sparrows and regretted it. In the late 1800s, some states offered bounties for killing English sparrows, considered invasive pests damaging crops. People collected sparrow heads or feet, trading them for cash payments. The program successfully reduced sparrow populations but had unintended consequences. Sparrows eat insects, and with fewer sparrows, insect populations exploded, causing worse crop damage than the sparrows ever did. The bounty programs were quietly discontinued. Similar wildlife bounty programs had comparable results throughout U.S. history. Wolf bounties in the early 20th century led to deer overpopulation and ecosystem imbalance. Predator control programs often backfire, removing species that play crucial roles in controlling other populations. The sparrow bounties are a classic example of ecological ignorance, solving one problem by creating worse problems. Modern wildlife management learned from these mistakes, understanding ecosystems better. But the sparrow bounty remains a cautionary tale about government intervention in nature. And speaking of unintended consequences, prohibition caused deadly problems. A law banning alcohol accidentally made poison sales skyrocket. During Prohibition, the government tried to stop people from drinking industrial alcohol by requiring manufacturers to add poisonous denaturants. The idea was making industrial alcohol undrinkable would prevent people from consuming it. Instead, people drank it anyway, desperate for alcohol. Bootleggers tried to remove the poisons through redistillation with mixed success. Thousands died from poisoned alcohol during Prohibition, victims of government policy designed to deter drinking, but which instead just made drinking deadly. By some estimates, 10,000 people died from poisoned alcohol between 1920 and 1933. The government knew people were dying but continued the policy, arguing it was drinkers' fault for breaking the law. Critics called it government-sanctioned murder. Prohibition ended in 1933, and the poisoning stopped. It remains one of the darkest policy failures in U.S. history, a law that killed thousands. And while poison was unintentional, some laws were just strange. One state required citizens to own firearms. Briefly, in 1792, Congress passed the Militia Act requiring able-bodied male citizens to own firearms and equipment for militia service. It wasn't enforced consistently, but technically, gun ownership was legally mandated for military-age men. Some states had similar laws requiring gun ownership for defense purposes. The laws were rarely enforced and eventually became obsolete as professional militaries replaced citizen militias. In modern times, some cities like Kennesaw, Georgia, passed symbolic ordinances requiring heads of household to own firearms, though with exemptions making it essentially unenforceable. These laws are more political statements than practical requirements. The Kennesaw Law passed in 1982 and remains on the books, though nobody's been prosecuted for not owning a gun. It's the inverse of gun control, a gun mandate, and it's just as controversial. The historical militia laws made sense in their context, but would be bizarre today. And speaking of laws that didn't work, sometimes the government just forgot to inform people. Congress once voted to rename a day and forgot to tell anyone throughout history. Various proposals to rename holidays or create new commemorations have passed, but failed to gain public awareness. Some official designations exist that almost nobody knows about. Congress has declared hundreds of official days, weeks, and months commemorating various causes, most of which go completely unnoticed. One example is National Whatever Day, countless niche observances that exist legally, but which no one celebrates. The declarations pass quietly, often as symbolic gestures for advocacy groups, then are promptly forgotten. Technically, every day is probably 15 different official observance days simultaneously, all unnoticed. It's legislative clutter, feel-good gestures that accumulate in the books without impact. Congress renames things regularly, creates commemorations frequently, and Most vanish immediately into obscurity. The intention is good, honoring causes and people, but the execution is forgettable. And speaking of things that didn't work as intended, some stamps were useless immediately. The government printed stamps that couldn't be used. In 1869, the post office issued a series of stamps featuring historical figures in elaborate designs. The stamps were beautiful but functionally problematic. The denominations were confusing, the designs were too intricate for clear postmarks, and postal workers had difficulty distinguishing between values. The series was replaced within a year, making the 1869 stamps some of the shortest lived in U.S. postal history. Millions were printed, many were never used, and they became valuable to collectors precisely because they were failures. Other stamp printing errors have created unusable stamps. Inverted images, wrong denominations, missing perforations. The most famous is the inverted Jenny, a 1918 stamp where the airplane printed upside down. Only 100 exist, and they're worth millions. The government occasionally prints things that don't work, realizes the mistake, and moves on. The failed stamps remain physical proof that even government printing has quality control issues, but stamps are small problems. Some geographical issues were much larger. A U.S. state almost joined the country twice. Texas has a unique history of nearly joining the United States multiple times. After winning independence from Mexico in 1836, Texas existed as an independent republic for 9 years. During that time, Texas applied for U.S. annexation multiple times, but Congress delayed, worried about upsetting Mexico and igniting war. Some Texans grew frustrated and considered other options, including remaining independent or even seeking British protection. Finally, in 1845, the U.S. annexed Texas, making it the 28th state. But the process was so delayed and contentious that Texas almost gave up and remained independent permanently. The annexation directly contributed to the Mexican-American War, as Mexico never recognized Texas independence and considered annexation an act of aggression. Texas is the only state that was previously an independent nation with its own foreign policy, currency, and military. The flag still reflects that pride. But Texas wasn't the only place that moved around geographically. Sometimes entire towns did. One U.S. town moved itself several miles. Hibbing, Minnesota moved itself 2 miles south between 1919 and 1921. The original town sat on top of valuable iron ore deposits, and mining companies wanted the land. Rather than lose the ore, they struck a deal. The mining companies would pay to relocate the entire town. Over 2 years, more than 200 buildings were physically moved on rollers and wagons to the new location. Houses, stores, even a hotel weighing several tons were transported intact. Some buildings were moved while people continued living and working inside them, which is both impressive and slightly terrifying. The old town site was demolished and mined, yielding millions of tons of iron ore. New Hibbing was rebuilt with modern infrastructure, funded by mining money. It's one of the few times an entire American town was successfully relocated without simply abandoning the old site. The move worked, and Hibbing thrived in its new location. But towns moving is one thing. Sometimes nature moved borders without asking permission. The Mississippi River has changed borders without permission. The Mississippi River naturally shifts course over time through erosion and flooding, which creates legal chaos. State borders along the river were originally defined by its location in the 17 and 1800s, but rivers move, sometimes dramatically, leaving land that was once Missouri suddenly on the Arkansas side, or vice versa. Supreme Court cases have addressed these border disputes repeatedly. In some cases, courts ruled that borders remain fixed even if the river moves. In others, borders moved with the river. It depends on whether the change was gradual or sudden. The result is confusing. Islands appear and disappear, land switches states overnight after floods, and property owners suddenly find themselves under different state jurisdictions. The Mississippi has rewritten borders dozens of times without consulting anyone. Modern surveys and GPS help track these changes, but historically, the river just did what it wanted. And speaking of geographic confusion, America briefly planned a 49-star flag. America briefly had a 49-star flag planned. When Alaska became a state in January the 1959, the US needed a new flag with 49 stars. Designs were prepared, flag manufacturers started production, and the 49-star flag became official on July 4th, 1959. But it lasted less than a year. Hawaii became a state in August 1959, requiring another flag change to 50 stars. The 50-star flag became official on July 4th, 1960. So the 49-star flag existed officially for less than a year, making it one of the shortest-lived flag designs in U.S. history. Some 49-star flags were produced and used during that brief window, and they're now collector's items. The rapid succession of Alaska and Hawaii's statehood created an awkward flag transition period. The current 50-star design has lasted over 60 years, the longest-running flag design in U.S. history. Unless Puerto Rico or another territory becomes a state, we're stuck with 50. But flags changing was expected. Some cities changing by burning was not. A city burned down so often it became normal. Chicago burned down multiple times in the 1800s, most famously in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. But that wasn't the only fire. Earlier fires in 1857 and 1868 destroyed large sections of the city. Chicago was built primarily of wood, and fire prevention was minimal. When fires started, they spread rapidly, consuming entire neighborhoods. After the Great Fire of 1871 destroyed much of the city, killing 300 people and leaving 100,000 homeless, Chicago rebuilt using brick and stone. But even after that, fires remained common. The city developed one of the first professional fire departments in response to constant fires. Rebuilding became routine, almost expected. Each time Chicago burned, it rebuilt bigger and more modern. The fires, while tragic, forced architectural innovation. Chicago's modern skyline exists, partly because the city kept burning down and rebuilding with better materials. It's urban renewal through disaster, repeated until the city finally learned. But Chicago eventually stopped burning. Some construction decisions left permanent marks. The White House was painted white to hide burn marks. In 1814, British forces invaded Washington during the War of 1812 and set fire to many government buildings, including the President's House. The building's exterior was badly scorched, with smoke stains and fire damage visible on the sandstone. After the war, repairs began, and workers painted the entire exterior white to cover the burn marks. This wasn't the original plan. The house had been a natural gray sandstone color before, but the fire damage was too extensive to clean, so they painted over it. The name White House became more common after this, though it wasn't officially called that until Theodore Roosevelt made it official in 1901. So the White House is white because it's hiding burn marks from when the British torched it. Every time you see it gleaming white in photographs, you're looking at historical damage concealed under centuries of paint. The building literally wears its scars beneath whitewash. And speaking of things that didn't stay where they belonged, America once claimed land it never actually controlled. The U.S. once claimed land it never controlled. Throughout the 1800s, the U.S. made territorial claims to areas it had no practical control over. The Oregon Territory dispute with Britain is one example. Both nations claimed the Pacific Northwest, but neither fully controlled it. The U.S. asserted claims to land inhabited by Native American tribes who had no interest in American sovereignty. After the Louisiana Purchase, the exact boundaries were unclear, leading to overlapping claims with Spain and later Mexico. The U.S. claimed vast territories on paper while having minimal actual presence or authority. The Adams-Honest Treaty of 1819 resolved some disputes with Spain, but vague borders remained. Maps showed American territory extending across regions where the government had never been, where no American settlement existed, and where indigenous nations governed themselves. Claiming land and controlling it are different things, but map makers colored it American anyway. Eventually, settlement and a military presence made the claims real, but for decades, US maps showed aspirational borders rather than reality. And speaking of borders, some were just drawn wrong from the start. Some state borders were drawn incorrectly and never fixed. The border between Delaware and Pennsylvania was surveyed incorrectly in the 1700s, creating a wedge of disputed land. The border was supposed to be a perfect arc, but surveying errors left gaps and overlaps. Rather than fix it, both states just accepted the weird border. The Missouri-Iowa border is another mess. It was supposed to follow specific rapids on the Des Moines River, but surveyors miscalculated, and the border ended up miles from where it should be. Missouri sued Iowa in the 1800s, and the Supreme Court had to settle it. The border still doesn't match the original description. Similar problems exist across the country. Borders that zigzag incorrectly, follow wrong landmarks, or ignore natural features they were meant to follow. Fixing them would require moving property lines, redrawing maps, and angering thousands of property owners, so states just leave the mistakes. Geography is messier than maps suggest, but at least borders are visible. Some lakes just vanished entirely. A lake disappeared and reappeared decades later. Tulare Lake in California was once the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, covering hundreds of square miles. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, farmers diverted the rivers feeding the lake for irrigation. By 1930, Tulare Lake was completely dry, turned into farmland. The lake bed became some of California's most productive agricultural land, and people forgot a lake was ever there. Then, during exceptionally wet winters, especially in 1969, 1983, and 2023, the lake reappeared, flooding farms and reviving the ancient lake bed temporarily. It's a geological ghost, appearing when rainfall is heavy enough, then vanishing again as farmers pump out the water. Tulare Lake proves that you can erase a lake from the map, but not from the landscape. The depression remains, waiting for enough water to fill it again. It's appeared and disappeared multiple times now. A reminder that nature doesn't care about property boundaries. And speaking of ground that doesn't cooperate, some cities are sinking. One city sank into the ground, slowly. New Orleans has been sinking for over a century, subsiding slowly as the Mississippi River Delta compacts and sea levels rise. Much of the city is already below sea level, protected by levees and pumps that constantly remove water. The French Quarter sits on higher ground and has subsided less, but newer neighborhoods built on drained swamps are sinking measurably. Some areas have dropped over 6 feet since the 1900s. Buildings tilt, streets flood easily, and the pumping system runs constantly. The subsidence is caused by groundwater extraction, sediment compaction, and lack of new sediment deposits since the river was leveed. New Orleans is literally sinking into the Gulf of Mexico at a rate of about 2 inches per year in some areas. Engineers keep building higher levees and more powerful pumps, but the fundamental problem remains. The city is below sea level and dropping. It's a slow-motion disaster that everyone knows about, but can't fully stop. And speaking of places that vanished mysteriously, America had one colony nobody could explain. America once had a lost colony no one could explain. Roanoke Colony, established in 1587 in present day North Carolina, disappeared entirely by 1590. When English supply ships returned after a 3-year delay, all colonists were gone, leaving only the word Croatoan carved into a post. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just an empty settlement. Theories include integration with local native tribes, starvation, disease, or Spanish attack, but no definitive evidence exists. The colony vanished so completely that it became one of American history's enduring mysteries. Archaeological research continues, finding artifacts suggesting some colonists may have moved inland or joined the Croatoan tribe, but their ultimate fate remains unclear. The lost colony predates permanent English settlement in America, making it a prologue to American history rather than a founding chapter. It's a reminder that early colonization was precarious and deadly. Most colonies failed. Roanoke failed so thoroughly that nobody knows what happened. The mystery persists over 400 years later, unsolved and likely unsolvable. But at least Roanoke was genuinely lost. Sometimes measurements were just wrong. A mountain was measured wrong for years. Mount Everest's height has been remeasured multiple times, each measurement slightly different. But closer to home, Mount Mitchell in North Carolina was long believed to be shorter than it is. Early surveys in the 1800s gave varying heights, some off by hundreds of feet. Measurement technology improves slowly, and mountains don't have clear tops if covered in vegetation or rock formations. The accepted height kept changing as surveying got better. Similarly, Mount Whitney in California had measurement disputes for decades. Different surveys gave different results, and map makers didn't know which to trust. Modern GPS and satellite measurement resolved most disputes, but historical records show wildly varying heights for the same mountains. The errors weren't incompetence, but technological limitations. Measuring a mountain accurately without modern tools is genuinely difficult. So for years, official heights were wrong, sometimes significantly. Maps confidently listed elevations that were off by dozens of feet, and nobody knew until better technology arrived. And speaking of inaccurate numbers, territorial counts were once confusing. The US once had more territories than states. In the late 1800s, the US controlled numerous territories that weren't states. At one point, there were more territories than states. Alaska, Hawaii, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and various island possessions all had territorial status simultaneously. The continental US had around 38 states while managing a dozen territories. Territories had limited self-governance, no voting representation in Congress, and were essentially colonial possessions. Some territories remained in that limbo for decades. Arizona and New Mexico were territories for over 60 years before statehood. Alaska was a territory for 48 years. The territorial system was America's version of empire, controlling land without granting full political rights. Eventually, most territories became states, but some, like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, remain territories today. They've been in territorial status for over a century, with residents who are U.S. citizens but can't vote for president. The territorial system persists, a colonial holdover nobody's fully addressed. And speaking of water acting strangely, some rivers don't follow normal rules. A river flows backward under certain conditions. The Chicago River famously flows backward, but that's engineered. Naturally, some rivers reverse flow during high water or tidal conditions. The St. Johns River in Florida flows north, unusual for rivers, but not technically backward, but several rivers genuinely reverse under specific conditions. The Tonle Sap River in Cambodia reverses seasonally, though that's not in America. In the U.S., the New River in West Virginia flows north through the Appalachians. defying typical drainage patterns. It's one of the oldest rivers in the world, predating the mountains it cuts through. Some tidal rivers reverse direction twice daily with tides. The Hudson River near New York is tidal for over 150 miles inland, flowing upstream at high tide and downstream at low tide. So technically, these rivers flow both directions depending on conditions. It's not truly backward, just bidirectional, but it confuses anyone expecting rivers to flow consistently one way. Nature doesn't follow rules we'd prefer. And speaking of places defying expectations, some islands have complicated national identities. One island has switched countries multiple times. The U.S. Virgin Islands were Danish until 1917, when the U.S. purchased them during World War I to prevent German acquisition. Before Danish control, they'd been Spanish, Dutch, English, and French at various points. The islands have been traded, sold, and conquered repeatedly, changing flags dozens of times over centuries. St. Croix alone has been under 7 different national flags. Residents have lived under multiple governments without moving. The 1917 sale to the U.S. made islanders American citizens, though they still can't vote for president. It's a strange colonial arrangement where people are Americans but lack full political rights. The island's history is typical of Caribbean territories, passed between empires like property, with residents having no say in their governance. Most switch flags due to European wars or financial deals having nothing to do with the islands themselves. The current status as a U.S. brain territory has lasted over a century, longer than most previous arrangements. But speaking of confused governance, one town accidentally banned itself. A U.S. town accidentally banned itself. Through legislative error, some towns have accidentally repealed their own incorporation documents, technically dissolving their legal existence. This happens when town councils vote to repeal outdated ordinances without realizing some of those ordinances include the town's founding charter. One example occurred in Kentucky when a small town repealed all previous ordinances, accidentally including the 1800s ordinance that incorporated the town. The town continued functioning because nobody noticed immediately, but legally it didn't exist. When discovered, the state legislature had to reincorporate the town. Similar incidents have happened elsewhere when careless legislative cleanup removes foundational documents. Towns continue operating because daily governance doesn't depend on 19th century paperwork, but legally they're in limbo. Fixing it requires state intervention, new incorporation votes, and legal complexity. It's bureaucratic self-erasure, unintentional but surprisingly easy. Towns exist through legal fiction, and sometimes that fiction gets accidentally deleted. And speaking of things that shouldn't exist but do, some maps are still wrong. Some places still use maps based on mistakes. Many modern property boundaries and legal descriptions reference surveys from the 17 and 1800s that contained errors. Rather than correct them, which would invalidate centuries of property records and require massive legal reformation, we just accept the wrong maps. Property deeds reference landmarks that no longer exist, describe boundaries using incorrect compass bearings, or cite surveys that were demonstrably wrong. Courts have ruled that historical surveys, even if provably incorrect, establish legal precedent that can't be easily overturned. So property lines follow mistakes, state borders include surveying errors, and maps show boundaries that don't match the original intent. Correcting these errors would create more problems than it solves. So we live with incorrect maps. It's path dependence. Once enough legal structure builds on a mistake, the mistake becomes reality. Modern GPS reveals these errors clearly but legally. The wrong maps win because changing them would be chaos. And speaking of holidays that don't match their names, Thanksgiving had a confusing history. The US once tried renaming Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's date changed multiple times throughout history. George Washington declared a Thanksgiving Day in 1789, but it wasn't annual. Abraham Lincoln made it a regular holiday during the Civil War, setting it as the last Thursday of November. Franklin D. Roosevelt tried moving it a week earlier in 1939 to extend the Christmas shopping season, calling it Franksgiving. Retailers supported the change, but many states refused to recognize it, celebrating on different dates. For 2 years, America had two Thanksgivings, 1 week apart, depending on the state. It was confusing and unpopular. Congress finally standardized it in 1941 as the fourth Thursday of November, where it's remained since. Roosevelt's attempt to rename and reschedule the holiday failed, but it created temporary chaos. The incident shows that even established traditions can be disrupted by economic considerations. Thanksgiving survived the renaming attempt and remains on its current date, mostly because people resisted change. But holidays aren't the only national symbols that almost ended up elsewhere. A famous monument was almost built elsewhere. The Statue of Liberty was almost erected in Philadelphia instead of New York Harbor. The statue was a gift from France, but the US had to provide the pedestal and site. Philadelphia wanted it for the centennial celebration, arguing it was more historically significant than New York. New York fought to keep it, launching fundraising campaigns. Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World, ran a successful campaign to raise funds for the pedestal, with donations from over 120,000 people, mostly in small amounts under $1. New York won, and the statue was erected on Bedloe's Island, now Liberty Island, in 1886. Philadelphia got nothing. Imagine the Statue of Liberty in the Delaware River instead of New York Harbor. It would be a completely different symbol, associated with different imagery. New York's identity is partly built around the statue, tied to immigration history and Ellis Island. Philadelphia would have a very different symbolic meaning. But we'll never know because New York fundraised better. And speaking of decisions based on unusual reasoning, one state capital was chosen for cold weather. A state capital was chosen because it was cold. Juneau, Alaska, became the capital in 1906, partly because it was more accessible than the previous capital, Sitka. But climate played a role. Juneau had a milder, though still cold, climate compared to interior Alaska. It was chosen over other candidates partly due to its location, accessibility by sea, and economic importance from gold mining. However, some accounts suggest that officials appreciated the cooler climate as deterring mosquitoes and making summer work more comfortable compared to warmer, mosquito-infested interior locations. The capital debate continues today with proposals to move it to Anchorage or Wasilla, but Juneau remains capital despite being inaccessible by road. The choice reflects priorities of the early 1900s, proximity to maritime trade, and relative comfort for government workers. Modern Alaskans debate whether a capital should be accessible by road or located near population centers, but Juneau stays capital partly through inertia. It's remote, expensive to reach, and slightly absurd, but it's home to Alaska's government. And speaking of absurdity, some historical facts taught in schools aren't actually true. One historical fact is taught mainly because it's convenient, not true. The story that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag is taught in schools as established fact, but historical evidence is thin. The story emerged decades after the supposed event, told by Ross's grandson with no contemporary documentation. It's convenient because it gives a clear origin story for the flag, provides a female founding figure, and offers a simple narrative for children. But historians largely consider it unverifiable, possibly apocryphal. Similarly, George Washington's cherry tree story, I Cannot Tell a Lie, was invented by Parson Weems after Washington's death. pure fiction presented as moral instruction. Many facts taught in schools persist because they're narratively useful, not because they're proven true. Teachers repeat them because previous teachers did, and they convey values or lessons, even if historically dubious. Columbus discovering America, Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock, Paul Revere shouting, "The British are coming," all are more legend than fact, but remain embedded in education. History education often prioritizes useful narratives over documentary accuracy, which creates a version of the past that's cleaner and simpler than reality. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through 101 ridiculous facts that somehow, against all odds, are completely real. And that brings us to 101 ridiculous facts that somehow survived documentation and made it into the historical record. So the next time you're worried about making mistakes or
And we're
getting
rolling
things
whenever you're
wrong,
ready.
just remember the government once paid people to kill sparrows and regretted it. A president got stuck in a bathtub. Congress debated banning umbrellas. The army lost a nuclear weapon and never found it. And through all of that chaos, confusion, and spectacular failure, America somehow kept going. History isn't the clean, orderly story we learned in school. It's messy and weird and full of people doing their absolute best while also doing some genuinely baffling things. And maybe that's comforting. Maybe knowing that confusion and absurdity have always been part of the American story makes the present feel a little less overwhelming. So tonight, as you drift off, be thankful you're not a president trying to figure out what to do with 1,400 pounds of cheese in your foyer, or a general explaining to your superiors that you accidentally bombed Florida during training. Sleep well. History will still be strange tomorrow.